Now we're going to take a look at another way to access databases with C++ Builder exe3. In the first dataset video, I used client dataset. This time I'm going to talk to an InterBase database using InterBase Express components. So I'll say File, New, FireMonkey Desktop Application, C++ Builder. We'll put down a TIB database. And the IB database component allows us to connect directly to an InterBase database. Under Users, Public Documents, Rad Studio, NO, Samples, Data, and we've got our an employee GDB, which has information about sales, orders, customers, employees. So that makes the database connection. In this case, I'm accessing it through local InterBase. I could also specify the server name here if I want to talk to an InterBase database that's running on another server. I can access it, get connected. It'll ask me for the username and password. I'll put those in. And now at design time, I'm connected to the database. So I don't have to log in each time. I'll turn off login prompt, and I'll set the parameters. My default password for local InterBase is master key. You can change that later on. And now again, when I connect to the database. So next thing I'm going to do is put a TIB query component. And the TIB query component is going to let me do a SQL query against the database. And I'm going to put a transaction component. Transaction component allows me to start and commit or roll back a transaction. I'll connect it to the default database. The default action is going to be to do a commit. Anytime I tell it to commit any retained transactions that might be hanging there. So we've got that connected. We'll connect up the default transaction to the IB database. And then for the query, we'll connect it to the same TIB database component. And then we've got a couple more properties to set in InterBase Express. One is the SQL statement. And this unidirectional property. If all we're going to do is read through the InterBase database and do things like display the data, not change it in any way, then I can turn unidirectional to true. And that way InterBase doesn't have to remember any of the data that it's moving through, because I'm never going to move back other than maybe in a visual grid in the user interface. So that's good for reporting operations. You're reading through the data, doing calculations and other things. If you want to edit on the form, you'll want to turn off unidirectional. Then InterBase components will cache the data in case you need to go back and make some changes in your user interface in your application. In this case, I'm just going to read through and display the data. So we'll bring up the SQL property inspector, and it shows me all the tables that are in my database. I'm going to use the customer table, but again, this InterBase employee database has got sales and projects and employees, jobs, countries, and so on. Let's take the customer table, and we can choose any fields columns that we want. I'm just going to take all of the columns from the database. So we'll select star from customer. And then now I've got that SQL statement in the database. And I can activate the query. And now I can go and say, let's do a live binding wizard. I want to link a grid and display a grid of data. So let's put a string grid. And the source, either a new source using the live binding wizard. In this case, I've got an existing source, which is my query. And I want to add a data source navigator to it. And then it generates all of that for us. So we'll put the navigator at the top. Let's go down and turn off the editing controls, because we just want to use this as a browsing kind of application. We've got first, prior, next, and last, and I'm going to keep on refresh button, which says if somebody changes the database in some other application, periodically I might want to do a refresh. Here's the bind source DB and the binding list, which are part of the live binding engine. Let's put the navigator at the top of our user interface, and we'll take this string grid and we'll align it to the rest of the client area. And now we've got our data, and we can take this data and run through it and take a look at it. Let's bring up the live binding designer as well, so we can see the mappings. There's the navigator, and here's the string grid. We might want to also put some other fields so we can see, like, for example, the first and last name in a field, or something else that we want to take care of. So we can add other fields, adding through the wizard or dragging and dropping components from your user interface. And now we take this application and run it. And we've got the data, and we can go through it. If we want to add changes, then we have to add a little more logic to be able to do SQL update statements or use a client data set and a provider resolver technology. More about that later in a future video. But that's how easy it is to create a simple application to display data in a database. You can also right mouse click and bring up the columns editor and add all the columns or fields, and you can manipulate the different properties of each of the columns. For example, their width, all of them will default to the same width, but if you want to change and make, for example, the customer name be a little wider, make that 150, and then when you're done, run the application, and the customer column will be a little larger. So lots of options for formatting, displaying the data. Again, go back to the columns editor and pick the different columns. You can put custom formats, give it a different header. So here in contact first name, we might instead want that just to be first name. And then for the last name, let's just call that last name in the header. And then when we run the application again, they'll have a little more friendly headings. And you can play with colors and all the other things. Since it's a FireMonkey application, we could also go in and change the style and load a different style. So for example, if we want to go and pick up one of the standard styles, we can go down here to Public Documents, Rad Studio, 10.0 Styles, and for example, let's pick the transparent style and say Apply and Close. And now we run this application, it'll have a nice transparent style that we can use. And we can scroll around and so on and resize. So all of that's available for us using FireMonkey, database access, in this case, InterBase, using the InterBase Express components, and the live bindings engine, and the string grid. So that's a quick look at accessing a SQL database, in this case, InterBase database. And in future videos, we'll access other types of databases using DB Express instead of InterBase Express, and see what more we can do with databases in C++ Builder exe3.